Welcome back or welcome in to Sleepless Scholar, where bedtime meets the quieter corners of history. If you're joining us again tonight, go ahead and get comfortable. Let your arms settle, let your breath slow just a little. And if you're new here, don't worry, you're in good company. No exams, no alarms, just long, gentle stories to ease you into rest. Before we begin, if you enjoy these slow, steady journeys into the past, feel free to subscribe. And if you're still awake, leave a comment letting me know what time it is where you're listening. It's always lovely to see the quiet night owls from every corner of the world gathered here together. Tonight's episode might sound a little sharper than usual, because we'll be talking about weapons, but don't worry, nothing too loud or sudden, just the soft creaking truth of how, for all their fame and fury, medieval weapons were mostly terrible. Rusty swords, bizarre pole arms, axes with more bark than bite, and of course, siege machines that broke themselves more often than they broke through enemy walls. We imagine the Middle Ages as a time of gleaming steel and clashing armies, but reality was often messier, duller, heavier, and far less elegant than the legends would have you believe. So tonight, we'll walk softly through the history of these tools of war. We'll talk about why knights struggled with their own armor, why early firearms were as dangerous to the shooter as the target, why crossbows weren't the instant win button you might think, and why, more often than not, the real battle was just getting your weapon to work at all. But as always, don't worry if you drift off along the way. That's the point. The weapons may have been awful, but the stories, well, those will carry you gently through the night. It's the star of so many stories, the knight's sword, a gleaming blade balanced perfectly, forged in secret flames by ancient masters. In tales, it sings through the air, cuts through armor, wins battles in a single stroke. But in reality, medieval swords were often far less glorious, heavy, brittle, imperfect, and at times more trouble than they were worth. Early medieval swords, especially in the centuries following the fall of Rome, were short and wide. They were built less for elegance and more like blunt tools. Most were made of low-quality iron, soft and prone to bending. A swing against a hard target, like chainmail or a shield, could warp the blade. A poorly aimed blow might not just miss, it might break the weapon altogether. These swords weren't mass-produced in factories. They were forged by hand, by blacksmiths who might have had only basic tools. Temperature control was inconsistent. Some blades had weak points baked right into the metal. And unless you were rich or lucky, you weren't likely to get a sword that could last more than a few encounters without maintenance. They were also difficult to carry. Early sword belts weren't designed for comfort. The blade would slap against your leg with every step. Drawing a long sword from a sheath strapped to your back like you see in movies? Nearly impossible. Most swords were worn at the hip, and drawing them smoothly required practice and space, neither of which you had when armor was pressing into your ribs or arrows were already flying overhead. And then there's the weight. Not as heavy as legend claims, most medieval swords weighed between 2 and 4 pounds, but the weight distribution could be awkward. Some swords were blade heavy, meaning their balance point sat far from the hilt. This made them feel like swinging a metal bat, tiring, slow, and prone to dragging your arm off course during longer battles. Training helped, of course. Knights and soldiers drilled daily to learn how to control that awkward swing, how to turn brute force into something closer to grace. But for the average levied foot soldier who barely got enough bread, much less training, using a sword was clumsy and exhausting. Many swords were also single-edged, blunt on one side, sharp on the other. They weren't meant to slice through someone cleanly. They were meant to hack, repeatedly, over and over. A grim, muddy, painful rhythm, more like chopping firewood than fighting dragons. And swords were expensive. A well-made sword could cost as much as a peasant's yearly income. Most soldiers didn't carry them at all. They used axes, spears, farming tools repurposed for violence. The sword was a status symbol more than a necessity. If you wore one, it meant you had rank, or money, or both. But even among nobles, sword ownership was sometimes ceremonial. Ornate pommels, jewels in the hilt, blades edged with Latin phrases. Beautiful? Yes. Useful? Not always. Some were so fragile they'd warp if actually used in combat. Others were kept dull to prevent accidents during processions or feasts. Of course, not all swords were bad. By the high Middle Ages, blacksmithing had improved. Steel became more common. Techniques like pattern welding created stronger, more flexible blades. And by the 13th and 14th centuries, the longsword emerged, a more refined, double-edged weapon designed for both cutting and thrusting. Better balance, better metallurgy. But even the best sword didn't make its wielder invincible. Because battle wasn't like a duel, it was chaos. Mud, shouting, flying weapons, shields smashing into ribs, horses panicking. You might not see the enemy until they were inches from you, and in that moment, with your heart thudding and your arm already sore, your sword, no matter how finely made, was only as good as your grip. Sometimes it was better to drop it and run. Still, the sword lived on, not just as a weapon, but as a symbol. Knights were knighted with them. Kings gave them names. Myths were wrapped around them like vines. Even when the battlefield moved on, when guns and pikes replaced blades, the sword stayed in our stories. But it's important to remember, the sword was never perfect. It bent, it broke, it slipped from tired hands. It required strength, skill, and maintenance. And often, in the cold of morning after a battle, it lay forgotten in the dirt, not a tool of destiny, just a piece of metal, and sometimes not even a very good one. They look simple, sturdy, brutal, honest. The medieval axe, no flourishes, no polish, just a chunk of metal fixed to a stick, ready to cleave through helmets and shields. It feels like the kind of weapon that must have worked perfectly. But the truth is, axes had problems of their own. Namely, they got stuck in everything. Axes were common, much more so than swords. Unlike a sword, an axe didn't need to be forged by a specialist. It was cheaper, easier to make, and you could repurpose a tool already hanging in a peasant's shed. If you could chop wood, you could chop a man. At least, that was the idea. But chopping wood isn't the same as surviving battle. The biggest issue? Penetration. Axes, especially broad-bladed ones, were great at biting into things. Flesh, bone, shield boards, but once they bit, they didn't like to let go. If you buried the blade deep, it often stayed there, in a shield, in an arm, sometimes even in a helmet, which meant your weapon, your only weapon in many cases, was now attached to another person who might still be moving, or swinging back, or collapsing with your axe, stuck in their ribs while others rushed toward you. You couldn't just yank it free, not easily, not quickly, not while wearing stiff boots and dodging arrows. Smaller axes, like the hand axe or Francisca, were easier to manage, but even they had trouble with binding, where the weapon clashed or caught on the opponent's armor or gear. And if your axe had a curved or bearded blade, it might hook even more easily. Some warriors adjusted. Vikings, for example, learned to use that hooking to their advantage, pulling down shields, catching arms, unbalancing enemies, but that required skill, precision, practice, and more often than not, battle gave you none of those things. There were throwing axes too. The Francisca was one of the most famous, hurled in high arc just before a charge. They were meant to disrupt formations, not necessarily kill, but if the blade caught a shield rim or someone's belt buckle, it often spun awkwardly, embedding in wood or falling uselessly to the dirt. Some fighters carried backup weapons, a dagger, a club, even a spare axe, because once the first one was stuck, they couldn't always get it back in time. And then there was the problem of armor. Axes could crush, but not always pierce. Against chainmail, a sharp edge could find gaps. Against padded armor, it could do serious damage. But plate armor, that was a different story. Even a heavy two-handed axe had to be swung with serious force to do more than dent or glance off the metal. That meant risking balance, stepping in close, leaving yourself open. Not ideal when the other man had a spear or a shield or friends coming up behind you. And many axe shafts were made of wood, not the fine treated wood of modern tools, but what was available, ash, elm or oak. Strong, yes, but brittle under the right pressure. If the shaft split or cracked mid-swing, the head could fly off. There are stories, rare but real, of warriors hitting a helmet and feeling the handle shudder, twist and snap in their hands. Worse still, in damp conditions, the wood could swell. If the axe head wasn't fitted properly, it might loosen. Imagine lifting your arm for a powerful overhead strike, only for the blade to launch off and vanish into the mud. Embarrassing, dangerous, and not uncommon. Still, the axe had its advantages. It was easier to make, cheaper to replace, better at punching through wooden shields than most swords, and in trained hands it was devastating. But in chaotic melees, muddy, crowded, fast, it had its share of problems, and perhaps the biggest was how often it didn't come back when you needed it. There's something uniquely terrifying about that moment, when the adrenaline fades, the swing finishes, and the weapon is just gone, lodged in someone's back, buried in a shattered shield, hung up on a chainmail collar. And now you're standing in the cold, your hands empty, with nothing left but your breath. So yes, axes were powerful, but they were not perfect, and sometimes they held on too tightly to the very thing you wanted to destroy. They're among the oldest weapons in human history. Spears, simple, elegant, efficient, a long shaft of wood, tipped with metal or fire-hardened point, able to keep enemies at a distance or pierce through armor with the right angle. In theory, they were the perfect battlefield companion, but on medieval soil, with mud underfoot and chaos overhead, spears were not always reliable, especially when they broke. Most medieval spears were made with ash or spruce, light enough to carry, flexible enough to withstand impact. But in the pressure of real combat, flexible could quickly become fragile. A spear's strength was in its reach. Soldiers could strike from behind a shield wall or jab at a charging foe before they got close enough to swing. But to hold that advantage, the shaft had to remain intact, and that was never guaranteed. In a full-speed charge, whether on foot or horseback, the spear had to absorb all the force of both attacker and target. If it hit armor or bone at the wrong angle, or if the shaft was already weakened from weather, termites, or wear, it snapped. Sometimes clean, sometimes jagged, sometimes with a splintering crack that left the wielder stunned and weaponless in the worst possible moment. Even worse, if the spear didn't break, it might bend. A bent spear couldn't thrust straight. The point would wobble or deflect. A slight curve in the shaft could send your lunge off center, turning a sure hit into an awkward fumble. And while some spears were built for single use, like lances, they weren't always labeled as such. A poorly trained foot soldier might try to reuse a throwing spear, only to find the shaft too warped to aim properly again. In the rain, the problems multiplied. Wet wood swelled, it became slippery, grip failed, and if the socket holding the spearhead was loose, the head could slide free completely. Suddenly, what had been a deadly weapon was just a stick, useless for piercing, awkward for swinging. Even the length was a liability. A longer spear gave more reach, but in tight formations, in forests, in castle corridors, it was a curse. You couldn't swing it, you couldn't turn. You'd jab once, maybe twice, and then spend the rest of the fight trying not to trip over your own weapon. And then there was the issue of retrieval. Once a spear struck a target, it often stayed there. Like the axe, it got stuck, especially in thick padding or mail. Removing it took time and effort, and in battle there was no time. You had to let it go. And suddenly you were holding nothing. Some soldiers carried short swords or daggers for this reason. Others turned the shaft into a club. But for many, the break of a spear was the end of their contribution. The weapon they trained with, carried across miles of terrain, polished and gripped with such care, shattered in seconds. There were sturdier spears, of course. Some were reinforced near the base of the head. Others had steel shafts entirely, though those were rare and expensive, usually reserved for elite guards or ceremonial troops. But the average soldier, he was handed a long stick with a point. If he was lucky, it was straight. If he was very lucky, it stayed that way. And still, spears were used everywhere, because when they worked beautifully. They held lines, they repelled cavalry, they could be massed into walls of bristling death, but when they didn't, they bent, snapped, splintered, and fell, and the soldier, muddy, breathless, wide-eyed, was left to find another way to survive. They looked like the future, compact, precise, mechanical. Unlike the longbow, which demanded years of practice and brute strength, the crossbow was a weapon of logic, point, pull, and fire. Anyone could use one, or so it seemed, but the truth beneath the crossbow's cold frame was slower, heavier, and far more tedious, because for all its power, it took forever to reload. The medieval crossbow had one great advantage: it could pierce armor. At short range, a well-made crossbow bolt could punch through chainmail, sometimes even into plate. It required less physical strength than a longbow, and it leveled the playing field. A trained peasant could take down a knight. It terrified nobles. It was banned by the church, and yet, despite all this, it had a problem that never quite went away: reload speed. A longbowman could fire 10, 12, even 15 arrows a minute. A crossbowman, 1, maybe 2, because loading a crossbow wasn't just a matter of pulling a string back. The tension in the weapon was immense, too strong for bare hands. Soldiers used tools, windlasses, cranks, goat's foot levers, and each reload took a full body effort. Step 1, plant the crossbow. Step 2, attach the device. Step 3, crank or pull until the string clicked into place. Step 4, load the bolt. Step 5, aim. Step 6, fire. That process might take 30 seconds, a minute in bad weather, longer under stress, and during that time you were exposed. Crossbowmen often had large Pavis shields, portable barriers they could crouch behind while reloading. Teams would rotate, one firing, one loading. But even then, enemies knew if they could charge before the next volley, the crossbowmen wouldn't be ready. The bolts themselves were heavy, shorter than arrows but dense. Some were tipped with broad heads, others with points meant for punching through mail. They did incredible damage, but you couldn't carry many, and they didn't curve through the air with elegance. They fell sharply, required careful aiming. Miss once, and your punishment was waiting, reloading while others advanced. The crossbow was also vulnerable to weather. Rain could warp the wooden stock, ice could stiffen the trigger, the grease used to lubricate the mechanism could freeze, and on muddy fields, the foot stirrups used to brace the weapon could slip. If a bolt misfired, if the string caught wrong, or if the nut mechanism jammed, it could be nearly impossible to reset mid-fight, and sometimes the tension was so high that the string would snap entirely, lashing across the shooter's face or chest. And yet, armies still used them, because when they did fire, the effect was shocking. A well-placed bolt could drop a knight from horseback, could break a shield wall, could sow fear. But it wasn't a weapon of rhythm, it was a weapon of patience. You waited, you measured, you made your one shot count, and then you disappeared behind the shield again, winding, pulling, trying not to hear the footsteps closing in. Crossbows were terrifying, but not because of what they did quickly, because of what they threatened to do slowly, quietly, deliberately. But in a battle where seconds mattered, that silence could sometimes feel too long. Of all the medieval weapons, few seem simpler than the mace. No edge to sharpen, no parts to assemble, just a heavy head, stone, iron or steel, fixed to a shaft, ready to swing. It was a weapon of brute force, of battering and bashing, of smashing through armor when blades couldn't. And in paintings and tales, the mace always seemed like a weapon of certainty. But for the people who actually wielded them, there was a common, often painful truth. Sometimes they hit back. The force of a mace came not just from its weight, but from the transfer of momentum. When it struck, it didn't slice, it crushed. The ideal target was something soft beneath something hard. A padded helmet, a rib beneath mail, a collarbone protected by nothing but cloth. But the problem wasn't always the target, it was the recoil. A badly aimed swing could bounce off metal. A glancing blow could twist the weapon in your grip. A solid hit, even on target, sent shockwaves back through the handle, up your wrist and into your elbow, over and over. After a few swings, your hand could go numb, your arm would tremble, and if you weren't gripping tight enough, if your gloves were wet or your grip was tired, the mace could jerk sideways or even fly out of your hands. Two-handed maces were even worse, heavier, longer, more powerful, yes, but more awkward. In tight quarters, they were nearly impossible to use. The wind-up took time, and once committed, the swing couldn't be pulled back. Miss, and you'd be off balance. Strike too hard, and the shock might jolt your shoulders or pull your foot off the ground. Some maces had flanges, raised ridges to help focus impact. Others were spiked, though these were more for intimidation than effectiveness. The spikes often bent or broke, and if they didn't, they sometimes got stuck, caught in armor, caught in bone, caught in the very thing you just tried to break. And then there were the chain maces, the morning stars, the flails, a spiked ball on a chain attached to a handle. They looked terrifying, and they were, but mostly for the person using them. The chain added unpredictability. Swing, and the head could wrap around a shield, or your own wrist. If it missed its mark, it might rebound and hit you in the chest, or the face, or the leg. Even trained soldiers found them difficult to control. In some cases, more accidents happened with flails in training than in combat. And in the middle of a muddy, chaotic melee, they were all but impossible to use safely. Maces had another problem: storage. They didn't fit well into belts or scabbards. They weren't easily slung over a shoulder. They were either in your hand or they were dropped, and once dropped, they were hard to retrieve quickly. The weight made them clumsy. They could sink into soft ground, or roll under a fallen body, or be kicked away in a scuffle. And unlike a sword or dagger, they couldn't be used subtly. A mace wasn't for dueling or flashing, it was for brute force. And brute force had a way of tiring a body faster than anything else. After 5-10 heavy swings, you were spent. Your fingers ached, your breath came hard, your ears rang with every blow that didn't land just right. Still, the mace had a role. It was a nightbreaker, a defense against armor when blades bounced off and arrows splintered. But even then, it demanded strength, control, and a tolerance for pain. Because when you hit someone with a mace, you felt it too. The shock, the tremble, the sting in your wrist and your teeth. It was less a weapon of dominance and more a test of endurance. And in the wrong hands, or the right hands, but the wrong moment, it was just as likely to punish the wielder as the enemy. They towered over the battlefield, lumbering machines of war meant to tear down walls, splinter gates, and shake cities to their foundations. Siege engines were the giants of medieval combat. Catapults, trebuchets, battering rams, towers that rolled on wheels as tall as men. But behind their size was a quieter truth. They were temperamental, fragile, and frequently fell apart before they ever touched a fortress. A good siege engine took time, days, sometimes weeks to construct. They were usually built on site, using timber, ropes, iron fittings, and the labor of dozens, sometimes hundreds of workers. They were impressive, yes, but they were also at their core enormous bundles of tension and guesswork. Take the trebuchet, a marvel of engineering when it worked. It used a long arm and a counterweight, sometimes several tons of stone or lead, to fling projectiles over great distances, but balance was everything. The sling had to be precisely the right length, the pivot needed to be oiled, the arm couldn't be warped, and the base had to be stable, on ground that was often muddy, rocky or uneven. Too much weight and the frame cracked. Not enough, and the projectile barely dribbled out of the pouch. More than once, trebuchets exploded on their first test fire, beams snapping, counterweights crashing to the ground, entire crews sent diving for cover. The very power that made them so feared also made them unpredictable. Catapults had similar issues. Their tension came from twisted ropes or sinew. These had to be dry, tightly wound, and perfectly aligned. If the tension was uneven, the projectile might veer wildly. If the ropes were too dry, they could snap. Too wet, and they lost their strength entirely. Some catapults were so delicate that they had to be warmed up, fired with small loads before being trusted with real stones. A misfire wasn't just disappointing, it could destroy the machine, injure nearby soldiers, or worse, send the load backward. And then there were siege towers, built tall to match the height of enemy walls, filled with archers and soldiers ready to storm the parapets. They looked menacing from afar, but they were made of wood, wood that was flammable, wood that could crack under its own weight, wood that often buckled as the tower slowly rolled forward over rough terrain. Wheels jammed, frames listed, doors jammed, ladders inside snapped as soldiers climbed too quickly. One unlucky bounce over a stone and the entire thing could tilt and collapse. Some towers never even reached the walls. Engineers misjudged the distance. The wheels bogged down in wet soil. The defenders targeted the base with fire arrows or boiling oil. One sharp hit and the siege tower was no longer a weapon but a coffin. Battering rams had their own share of problems. Hung from chains or ropes, covered in a protective roof, they were meant to slam into gates again and again. But if the ram wasn't positioned exactly right, it would swing awkwardly, miss its mark, wedge into stone, or simply not gather enough force to do any real damage. Worse, if the ram broke mid-swing, cracking along the grain, or splintering from overuse, it was done. There was no quick fix. The men operating these machines, they had to be brave, but they also had to be patient, because nothing about siege engines was fast. Not their building, not their moving, and certainly not their fixing. In many cases, more time was spent trying to keep the machines standing than actually using them, and all the while, defenders on the walls above were ready with arrows, rocks, insults and fire. Even the sound of a siege engine groaning under its own weight could deflate morale. Soldiers would watch as the Great Hope, the mighty machine, creaked, tilted and cracked like old furniture long before it ever fired a shot. But despite all their flaws, siege engines remained part of medieval warfare, because when they worked, they changed everything. A well-placed boulder could breach a wall, a tower that reached the parapets could pour soldiers over the defenses. A ram, persistent and protected, could splinter a gate that no man could break alone. But when they didn't work, they collapsed in the mud, burned in the night, or stood still, silent and unused, as monuments to the difficulty of turning ideas into reality on a noisy, chaotic battlefield. There's something about fire that's always captured the imagination, unpredictable, hungry, dramatic, And in war it promised power, fear, finality. Medieval armies, fascinated by its destructive beauty, tried again and again to turn fire into a weapon, and sometimes they succeeded. But more often than anyone liked to admit, it went terribly wrong, because fire, unlike a sword or an arrow, didn't care who it hurt. Let's start with the most famous, Greek fire. Developed by the Byzantine Empire, it was a terrifying substance, part liquid, part legend. Shot from siphons on ships, it clung to water and burned anyway. It could ignite on contact, sticking to wood, sails, and skin. No one outside Byzantium knew the exact recipe, and many who tried to replicate it failed spectacularly. Why? Because working with flammable chemicals in an age without goggles, fume hoods, or fire extinguishers was dangerous. Recipes varied wildly: resin, pitch, sulfur, oil, lime. Some worked, others simply exploded. There are records of alchemists and engineers burned alive by their own mixtures, sometimes in the testing phase, sometimes on the battlefield. And even when the mixtures worked, the delivery systems didn't always cooperate. Pressurized siphons could leak or misfire, storage containers overheated, wind changed direction mid-battle, sending flaming jets back toward the attackers. Ships went up in flames, siege lines collapsed into chaos. Some commanders simply gave up on using fire, deciding it was better to face the enemy cold than burn with your own ambition. Then came flaming arrows, romanticized in film, archers dipping their arrows in oil, setting them alight, launching glowing trails through the night sky. In reality, less dramatic. A flaming arrow needed constant oxygen to stay lit. The moment it left the bow, the wind threatened to snuff it out. Many didn't stay burning long enough to matter, and when they did, they often landed short or long, setting fire to grass, carts, or friendly tents. Archers had to be careful not to burn their own bows, or sleeves, or hands. Fire pots, clay jars filled with oil and pitch were another option. Launched by catapults or thrown by hand, they could burst into flames on impact, but they were heavy, fragile, dangerous to store in bulk. Drop one and your own encampment could become a lesson in regret. And let's not forget boiling oil, a favorite in castle sieges. Pour it down on invaders trying to scale the walls. The thing is, boiling oil was hard to manage. It took time to heat, a lot of time, and fuel, and sturdy containers. If it spilled inside the wall, or a fire broke out near the vats, defenders could be scalded, or worse. In many castles, it wasn't oil they used at all, it was water, or sand, or lime, safer, easier, less likely to coat the cook. But that didn't stop armies from trying. Molotov-like firebombs, tar-drenched hay bundles rolled toward siege lines, fire arrows tied to livestock. Yes, livestock. In some cases, pigs or birds were coated in flammable substances and set loose, with the hope they'd wander into enemy camps or stables. Unsurprisingly, the animals panicked, ran the wrong way, set fire to friendly stores, or scattered into the wilderness, leaving behind only confusion and scorched grass. And yet, the dream of controlled fire persisted, because fire frightened people. It made them retreat. It turned the air smoky and strange. It disrupted formations. It sent messages. We'll destroy you, even if we destroy ourselves in the process. But for all that terror, the truth on the ground was more awkward. Soldiers slipping on spilled oil, archers singeing their eyebrows, commanders shouting, aim for the tents, only to see their own flags catch flame. It was, in the end, an untamable ally, and in the middle of battle, surrounded by shouting and steel, the last thing anyone wanted was to wonder which side the fire was on. The helmet is one of the most essential pieces of armor. Protect the head, and you protect the center of everything: sight, breath, command. But in medieval times, protecting the head often came at a price, because the better your helmet worked, the less likely you were to see, well, anything at all. Early helmets were simple, open-faced, often just iron caps or nasal helms, steel domes with a single bar down the nose. They didn't offer full protection, but they let you breathe, they let you see, and on a chaotic battlefield, those two things counted for a lot. But as weapons got stronger, helmets had to evolve. Enter the great helm, heavy, boxy, imposing, and nearly blind. It covered the entire head, front, back, sides, with narrow slits for eyes and small holes for breath. From the outside, it looked terrifying. From the inside, it was like staring out of a narrow mailbox. Your vision was limited to a straight line ahead. No peripheral vision, no glancing down. And in the press of battle, where threats came from all angles, that was more than inconvenient. It was dangerous. Soldiers learned to turn their whole body to look to the side, to lift their heads slightly to see downward. Some even peeked through the breathing holes when they needed a better angle. But even then, vision wasn't the only problem. These helms trapped heat. On a warm day, or even a cool one after marching, the air inside quickly became stifling. Breath bounced off the interior and fogged the metal near your face. Sweat poured down into your eyes, and if the helmet shifted during movement, you could end up staring at your own cheek plate while stumbling through the mud. Communication was difficult too. Try shouting through a narrow slit of metal, your words muffled, your tone flattened. Orders got lost, cries for help faded. Some helmets made voices echo so strangely that commanders removed them just to be understood. By the 14th and 15th centuries, more advanced designs emerged, like the bassinet with a visor. The visor could be lifted, offering a compromise between protection and visibility, but that came with its own issues. Raise the visor and you exposed your face. Lower it and you return to the world of tunnel vision. In tournaments, knights often wore specialized helms, massive constructions designed for jousting. They were beautifully crafted and nearly useless off horseback, top-heavy, poorly balanced. Some required attendants just to put them on or remove them. They offered excellent facial protection and almost zero practical vision. Archers and lighter troops often went without helmets entirely, or wore open ones, not because they didn't want protection, but because they needed to see where they were going. Running through a battlefield with your head in a steel box wasn't bravery, it was often suicide. Even mounted knights, trained in the weight and balance of full armor, had to adapt. Horses could sense threats their riders couldn't see, and knights learned to trust that sense, especially when they were blinded by their own defense. Later helmets added more mobility, better hinges, and even neck articulation, but visibility remained a compromise. A knight who could see well was a knight who was vulnerable. A knight who was fully protected often didn't know what was coming until it was too late. And still, helmets were worn because blindness was better than death, because a blow to the face, unguarded, was often final, because even in darkness a soldier had a better chance behind steel. But that didn't make it any less frustrating. Imagine crouching behind a shield, peering through a slit no wider than your thumb, hearing the clash of metal and the whistle of arrows, and realizing you can't even see the person trying to kill you. Just a blur, a shape, a shadow, and if you turned your head too far, all you'd see was your own armor, cold and blank. The longbow is often painted as a symbol of precision, a quiet killer from a distance, drawn smoothly, fired confidently, and feared across medieval battlefields. In the hands of an English archer, it won wars, it turned tides, it filled the sky with death. But what most stories forget to mention is that bows, especially powerful ones, broke, often, at the worst possible moments, and when they did, the results could be painful and occasionally fatal for the person holding them. Bows weren't fragile in appearance. They were made from yew or elm, sometimes horn and sinew in composite forms. Strong, yes, but also alive in a way. A longbow had to be kept at just the right humidity. Too dry and the wood became brittle, too wet and it softened. Either way, the tension was always there, pulling against the grain, ready to snap if mishandled. Drawing a longbow required strength, serious strength. War bows could have drawn weights of over 100 pounds, meaning that each shot took force and control. The bow flexed under that pressure, and if there was the smallest crack, the faintest weakness, it could give way. Sometimes the snap came in the upper limb, sometimes the lower, sometimes in the very center, where the pressure was greatest and the archer's hand wrapped around the grip. When a bow broke, it wasn't a polite, quiet thing. The wood splintered violently. Fibers snapped with a sharp, whip-like sound. The force stored in the drawn limbs had to go somewhere, and it often shot backward, into the arm, the face, the ribs. An archer could lose an eye, crack a wrist, get impaled with splinters. In some cases the string snapped instead. A bowstring was under constant tension. It had to be waxed, kept dry, kept taut, but not over-tightened. If it was frayed or weakened, it could snap mid-draw, lashing across the hand or face with a sound like a whip crack. A bad snap could open the skin, bruise the chest, or even cut deep enough to leave a scar. And on the battlefield, you didn't get a second try. One broken bow might mean retreat or death. Archers carried spares, but not always many. They carried extra strings, but re-stringing a bow in the middle of a skirmish was like threading a needle during an earthquake. Composite bows were even more fragile. Used in the East, they were made of horn, wood, and sinew, glued together in curved layers. Powerful and compact, they were marvels of engineering, but they were sensitive to moisture, heat, shock. A drop, a fall, or even being stored in the wrong orientation could ruin one. Horses jolting at the wrong moment could snap a bow strapped to a saddle. Even resting a foot on a bow for too long, trying to flex it, could cause a stress fracture. Training was everything. Archers had to be careful, respectful of their tools, constantly checking for cracks, listening to the creak of the limb, feeling the string tension with their fingers, not just their eyes. And even with all that, sometimes it just broke, not from error, not from age, but from the sheer tension built into the design, because to store that much force inside a curve of wood and string is to play with invisible fire, and sometimes it burned, quietly, suddenly, with a jolt that left your hands empty and your target untouched. They were supposed to be your lifeline, your last defense, the thing between you and everything sharp. A good shield could mean the difference between surviving a blow and vanishing beneath it, but not all shields were created equal, and in medieval battles, plenty of them, especially the cheap ones, broke on the very first hit. Most early medieval shields were made of wood. Linden was common, lightweight, flexible, but not always sturdy. Other woods included poplar or fir, chosen for availability more than strength. To reinforce them, smiths added iron rims, leather coverings, or even layers of rawhide. But these additions only helped so much. A heavy axe, a lance, or even a hard swing from a well-made sword could crack a shield clean in half, or send splinters flying into the face of the man holding it. Shields had to be made light enough to carry, but strong enough to block. That balance was tricky. Make it too thick, and your arm tired quickly. Make it too thin, and the first blow was also the last. And let's talk about the grips. Some were simple bars, others were leather straps, but not all were attached well, and in battle things moved fast. The strap might snap, the handle might loosen. A direct hit could shear off the grip entirely, leaving the shield dangling or twisting in your hand like a broken door. The famed kite shields of the Norman era were large and elegant, tapering down the length of the body, but their surface area made them bulky, easy to hit, and once struck with a lance or flanged mace, their long bodies sometimes cracked along the grain. Once cracked, they bent. Once bent, they were nearly impossible to control. Round shields were faster, but smaller. They required precision. You had to move with the blow, angle the shield just right to deflect. Dead-on impacts sent a jolt through your arm, shoulder, even spine. And if the wood was damp, it split even faster. Moisture was a constant enemy. Rain soaked into the layers, weakening the glue. Sun dried them out, causing splits. Leather coverings curled, paint flaked off. The more beautiful the shield looked before the fight, the more likely it was to fall apart under pressure. Then there were bossed shields, circular shields with a metal dome at the center. They could punch back, absorb strikes, but only in the middle. Hits to the edges, where the wood was thinner, unprotected, were often devastating. And in a melee, no one politely aimed for the center. Shields were weapons too. Some warriors used them to bash, to shove, to hook, but every impact weakened them, dented the frame, stressed the rivets, and the more you used your shield offensively, the faster it fell apart defensively. Some armies issued mass-produced shields, quickly made, barely tested, stamped with a symbol, sent to war. These were the ones that snapped cleanly in two, that splintered so badly they left the user more vulnerable than if they'd carried nothing. And when they broke, they didn't break quietly. The sound was deep, hollow, final, a thud, then silence, then panic. Suddenly, the soldier holding it was exposed, unarmed, one side open to the chaos. Some tried to fight on with just a frame, others dropped it and ran. A broken shield was like a promise unkept, and still they were carried, because a flawed shield was better than none, because in the moments before it broke, it still caught the arrow, still stopped the sword, still gave the soldier that one extra breath to decide, fight, flee, or fall. It's easy to imagine knights marching onto the battlefield in shining armor, polished, perfect, and prepared for anything. But the truth behind the gleam was slower, heavier, and far more complicated. Because medieval armor, especially full plate armor, didn't just take effort to wear, it took time. Sometimes more time than the actual battle. Chainmail came first, rings of iron, thousands of them, woven into tunics and leggings. It was flexible, and for a while it was enough, but it wasn't light. A full set could weigh 40 pounds or more, and that weight wasn't evenly spread. It dragged down at the shoulders, pulled across the chest, moved only when you moved, clinking with every step, and it didn't protect against blunt force. A mace might not pierce the mail, but it could still break the ribs underneath. So armor evolved. By the late medieval period, plate armor had arrived. Full suits, breastplates, pauldrons, gauntlets, greaves, each piece shaped to match the body, articulated joints, hinged elbows, sliding plates for the knees. A masterpiece of design and a nightmare to put on. First, you needed padding, gambesons and arming doublets, thick quilted garments worn beneath the metal to prevent bruising. These alone were heavy, hot and stiff. Then came the armor. You couldn't do it alone. You needed a squire, or two, or three. They helped tie the cords, buckle the straps, secure the fittings. It took time, half an hour on a good day, longer if anything was misaligned, and everything had to be done in order. You couldn't put on your gauntlets if your arms weren't strapped. You couldn't strap the cuisses on your thighs if your tunic was crooked. It was a sequence, a ritual, and all the while the clock ticked, the enemy approached, the banners were raised, and you were still fastening your sabatons. In some cases, the battle was over before the knight even mounted his horse, ambushed, delayed, left behind. There are records, real ones, of knights who arrived fully dressed only to discover the skirmish had moved on, or ended, or never happened at all. And once you were armored, movement was possible, but clumsy. You could walk, even run, but not easily. Sitting was awkward. Mounting a horse was an ordeal. Going to the bathroom, let's just say it wasn't graceful. In hot weather, the suit became a furnace. In cold, a freezer. Sweat pooled under the padding, and you couldn't scratch an itch. Not on your back, not on your nose, not anywhere. The visor blocked your vision, the helmet trapped your breath. The gauntlets made even simple gestures feel like wielding oven mitts made of steel. And heaven help you if you fell, on your back especially, because getting up in full plate without help was possible but difficult. The armor worked best when standing, moving, fighting, not flailing on the ground like a flipped beetle. Still, it worked. A full suit of plate was nearly invulnerable to arrows. Sword strikes glanced off. Even blunt weapons had to land just right to do damage. Against less equipped foes, it was terrifying, but it was a gamble, because if the battle didn't come to you, or came too fast, or went too long, you might find yourself armored for a fight that never happened, or exhausted before the first sword was drawn. And once the fighting started, you didn't stop to adjust a strap or tighten a buckle. You endured, clanking, grunting, moving like a night-shaped furnace until either the battle was won or the armor was removed by someone else, not always gently. So yes, armor could save your life, but it could also steal your time, and time in battle was everything. The image is iconic. A knight in full armor, lance lowered, thundering across the field on a majestic warhorse, dust rising, the enemy trembling, a perfect, unstoppable charge. But the truth is, medieval horses weren't machines. They were living creatures with thoughts, feelings, and, sometimes, absolutely no interest in charging. War horses, or destriers, as they were called, were trained for battle, bred for strength, agility, and obedience. But even the best training didn't erase fear. A horse knows what danger feels like. It sees movement, senses tension, smells blood. And when the time came to charge into a wall of spears or a forest of shouting men with axes, some horses simply stopped. Flat refusal. No rear, no buck, just frozen, locked in place. Others would veer off, trying to circle the danger rather than go through it. Some bucked, some turned around, and a few bolted completely, dragging their confused rider in the opposite direction of glory. Even for trained war horses, the battlefield was chaos. Noise, fire, screaming, flying objects, the clang of metal, the smell of sweat and panic. Riders could kick, shout, tug, lean, all the commands they'd practiced, but the horse had a mind of its own, and when it decided that self-preservation outweighed honor, there was little the rider could do. There were stories, too many to count, of charges that failed, not because the men hesitated, but because the horses did. Some cavalry units spent months, years, training with their mounts, teaching them to charge in formation, to brace for impact, to ignore distractions. But even then, there were no guarantees. A single misstep, a gopher hole, a puddle, a loose stone could spook the entire line. Horses were also sensitive to the rider. A nervous knight made a nervous mount. If your hands shook, your breath raced, your grip faltered, the horse felt it. And when your nerves hit their peak, right before the clash, the horse might decide, on your behalf, that it wasn't worth it. Armor added another problem. War horses often wore their own gear, barding, metal or leather plates, sometimes chainmail. It made them look fearsome, but it added weight, made them slower, less maneuverable, and the more burdened they were, the more reluctant they became to rush into danger. And then there was mud. A muddy field could sap a horse's energy before the charge even began. Their hooves slipped, their pace slowed, and by the time they reached the enemy, they were tired, off balance, and increasingly disinterested in the whole affair. In some battles, commanders tried tricks, drums, whistles, trained led horses to set the pace. But if the line hesitated, if one horse faltered, the rest often followed, because horses, for all their power, are herd animals. They move together, and they pause together, so when one refused, the ripple spread. Still, horses were essential. A mounted warrior had speed, height, impact, but the horse had the final say, and in those quiet moments, just before the charge, the knight's fate sometimes rested on the ears of a creature who, deep down, knew that steel was not its friend. They were the centerpiece of the knight's charge, the lance, long, elegant, deadly. In the tournaments, they were symbols of skill and honor. On the battlefield, they were weapons of momentum, meant to crush lines, break shields, and unseat men from horseback in a single thundering pass. But in practice, lances were less permanent weapons and more one-use battering rams, because most of them shattered on impact. A typical medieval lance was between 10 and 14 feet long, made of ash, spruce or pine, woods chosen for their balance of weight and flexibility. The head was usually tipped with iron or steel, sometimes flared, sometimes narrow and piercing. And while they looked powerful, they weren't built to last. That wasn't a flaw, it was intentional. A lance that didn't break could transmit all the impact back to the rider. The jolt of hitting another armored man at full speed could dislocate the shoulder, crack a wrist, or send vibrations deep into the chest. But if the shaft splintered on contact, that energy went somewhere else, into the wood, into the air, into flying fragments. But when the lance broke, it really broke. It didn't just snap in half. It shattered. Splinters sprayed in every direction, into armor caps, under visors, even back into the knight's own face. Some riders emerged from a successful charge, coughing blood or blinking through splinters lodged in their cheeks. In the heat of battle, knights didn't have extra lances on hand. A broken lance meant drawing a sword or mace and continuing the fight on horseback, or dismounting altogether. There wasn't time to fetch another. Some riders tried to hold onto the remains, using the broken shaft as a club, but it was awkward, off balance, and sometimes dangerously sharp. In tournaments, where the goal wasn't death but display, lances were deliberately weakened, scored along the grain, hollowed slightly, designed to break on impact. It made the clashes safer, or at least less lethal. But even then, mistakes happened. Visors weren't fastened, shields dropped too low, and the lance, instead of shattering, pierced. Even on the field, there were miscalculations. If the angle was wrong, the lance might skid off the target and slam into the ground, snapping the tip and jolting the rider. If the enemy turned at the last moment, the blow might miss entirely, and the momentum would carry the rider too far, too fast, straight into chaos. And if the wood was flawed, if there was a knot in the grain or a weakness near the base, it might snap before impact, mid-charge, leaving the rider galloping into battle with nothing but a stick and surprise. Lances were also awkward to carry, too long for easy storage, too wide for close quarters. Riders often had to lower them early, brace them under the arm, and keep them steady as the horse galloped. Any wobble in the aim could throw off the strike. Any misalignment could mean a glancing blow, or none at all. And in the rain, they warped, bent just slightly enough to throw off aim, softened just enough to break too soon, and yet they were used anyway. Because when a lance did land true, when it held together just long enough to strike with full force, it could unmake an entire line. It could scatter footmen. It could drive fear into the hearts of men who had no answer for galloping hooves and a forest of pointed wood bearing down on them. But afterward, the lance was done, splintered, dropped, forgotten in the mud. A brief, violent tool, less a weapon, more an opening move in the long, exhausting waltz of medieval combat. The dagger was a weapon of closeness, quiet, personal. It wasn't made for charges or duels at dawn. It was for when everything else had failed. When the sword was lost, the shield shattered, the spear gone. It was the final tool in the soldier's kit, small enough to hide, sharp enough to hope. But in medieval warfare, hope wasn't always enough, because when the fighting got close, daggers often got stuck. Chainmail was a marvel in its own right. Thousands of interlocking rings, flexible and durable, wrapped around the body like a second skin of steel. It wasn't invincible, but it was effective, especially against slashing weapons. Daggers, meant for stabbing, had a better chance, but only in the right places. To pierce chainmail, you had to aim between the links, find the gaps, work the point through the rings under the arm or behind the knee or at the neck where the coif hung loose. But in a fight, with hands shaking and the enemy squirming, that was far easier said than done. Most soldiers didn't have time for precision. They stabbed where they could, desperate, fast, brutal, and if the dagger met a solid patch of chain, one of two things happened. It slid off, or it caught. Daggers were narrow, thin, tapered to a point, which meant they could thread into the mail, but sometimes they threaded in too well. The blade would enter, twist slightly, and lock against the rings. Pulling back didn't always work. The point hooked under the metal, the handle turned, and suddenly your weapon was stuck in the very armor meant to protect your target. If the enemy was already falling, that wasn't so bad, but if they were still fighting, if they turned, rolled, pushed, you found yourself yanked forward by your own weapon, your hand trapped, your balance broken. Some daggers snapped under pressure. The tang, the hidden part of the blade inside the handle, wasn't always strong. Cheap weapons broke, handles cracked, blades bent, and once bent, a dagger was useless for piercing. A blunt point had little hope against even the loosest mail. And then there was the risk of gloves. Many armored gloves were clumsy. Holding a dagger tightly required a firm grip, and when the dagger stuck, that grip had to be released quickly to avoid being dragged. But the gloves caught on the hilt, or the hand hesitated, or the wrist was pulled at a strange angle, and the soldier stumbled, or worse, fell. Even when the dagger struck true, it could wedge between ribs, stick into wood, or drive so deep into the body that pulling it free was a fight of its own. There are stories of men killing an opponent with a dagger, only to spend precious seconds trying to retrieve the blade, tugging at the hilt with both hands while others advanced around them. Some simply let go, drew another weapon if they had one, or backed away, suddenly defenseless. Daggers were carried everywhere, tucked into boots, strapped to belts, hidden beneath cloaks. They were useful for eating, for cutting rope, for finishing wounded enemies with quiet finality. But in the press of battle, when armor groaned and mail shifted and movement was tight and breath came short, they weren't perfect, and the same narrowness that made them deadly also made them difficult to retrieve. Still, every soldier carried one, because when the sword was gone and the shield dropped and the spear broken, you reached for the dagger and prayed it would be enough. The medieval world produced countless weapons, some famous, some forgotten, and some so peculiar that they seemed designed more for imagination than for war. Spikes upon hooks, chains attached to blades, curved poles with iron prongs, and while a few of these oddities found a moment in history, many ended up in a soldier's hands with a simple, quiet problem. No one really knew how to use them. Take the man-catcher. Yes, that was a real weapon. It looked like a long pole with a metal ring at the end, split down the middle and fitted with inward-facing spikes. Its purpose? To catch people, specifically to unhorse-mounted knights, or pull them from balconies without killing them. It was meant to grab and restrain. In theory, useful. In practice, awkward. Trying to loop a struggling opponent with a forked pole while dodging swords and arrows required precision, timing, and nerves of steel. Most soldiers who held one hadn't trained with it. They'd seen a picture, maybe watched someone use it once, and then were expected to make it work in the heat of battle. They often didn't, or the military flail. It looked terrifying, a wooden handle attached to a chain which connected to a spiked ball or blade. The idea was that the chain allowed the weapon to swing around shields or crash over obstacles, but for the average soldier, flails were unpredictable. They wrapped around wrists, they bounced off armor and came back with surprising enthusiasm. They required perfect timing and a firm grip, or the wielder risked losing control or teeth. Most flails used in battle were much simpler. A heavy club, a short handle, fewer variables, but the elaborate ones still appeared in armories and on the battlefield, sometimes handed to men with no clue how to swing them without injury. Then there were pole arms with names like bec de Corbin and Lucerne hammer, part axe, part spear, part hammer. These weapons were designed to solve every problem at once. You could hook a shield, spike a helmet, bash a knee, but unless you trained with each motion, they became burdensome. Too many options, too many angles. In the moment, soldiers often defaulted to the most familiar move, swinging it like a stick and hoping it worked. Weapons like the Godendag or the holy water sprinkler sound dramatic, and they were. Spiked clubs meant for crowd control or brutal close quarters combat, but there was often no manual, just a handle, some metal, and the urgent need to figure it out quickly. Some weapons were regional, used only in one small corner of Europe. Invented by a local blacksmith or militia leader and passed along with minimal explanation. When these weapons made their way into larger armies, they confused more than they helped. Officers didn't know how to incorporate them into formations. Soldiers didn't know where to wear them, and when they failed, they were quietly discarded. Occasionally, rare weapons were made just to look intimidating. Massive blades, oversized axes, spiked gauntlets, designed more for ceremony than battle. But in desperate times, they were pressed into service, and the person handed one simply had to guess. How do you carry this? Swing this? Survive with this? Some historians believe that a few of the stranger weapons we see in museums weren't for fighting at all. They were prototypes, showpieces, the result of experimentation that never made it past a handful of tests. Yet somewhere along the way, a soldier picked one up and walked into battle, hoping for the best. It's easy to forget that training wasn't always widespread. Many fighters were levied peasants, given what was available. If what was available was a hooked pole with blades on 3 sides and a handle too long to hold steady, then that's what they carried, and hoped they wouldn't have to use, or prayed they'd find a better weapon on the battlefield. Something simpler, more familiar, a spear, a sword, a rock. Because sometimes the more complicated the weapon, the more likely it was to fail, not from design, but from confusion. A strange weapon in untrained hands was more danger to the wielder than the enemy. Still, those weapons existed, because war is not only about tradition, it's about trial and error, and sometimes error looked like a man swinging a double-headed, chained crescent blade pole arm for the first and last time. They were the future, the promise of fire and thunder in a world ruled by steel and silence. Early firearms were meant to change everything, and in time they did, but in their first appearances they were just as likely to harm the shooter as the target, because medieval guns, especially the earliest ones, had a habit of exploding, sometimes without warning, sometimes right in your hands. The first European guns appeared in the 14th century, heavy, clunky things made of wrought iron or bronze, mounted on wooden frames or simple stands. They looked more like tiny cannons than personal weapons. You packed powder down a tube, dropped in a ball or stone, lit a fuse, or touched a glowing iron rod to the priming powder and prayed. The powder didn't always ignite evenly. Sometimes it fizzled, sometimes it flared too fast. Barrels made of weak or inconsistent metal couldn't always handle the pressure, and when they cracked or burst, it was sudden, brutal, and almost always loud. A failed shot might blow the breech cap off, or split the barrel sideways, or shoot sparks straight back into the face of the operator. Burns, lost fingers, even death. These were all possible outcomes of trying to fire what was essentially a metal pipe full of fire in an age with very little quality control. Some early handheld guns, like the hand-con, required a second person just to help aim or steady the weapon. You'd brace it against your chest or out support, touch the match to the hole and hope it fired forward, and only forward. If the powder was packed too tight or the barrel was cold and damp, the shot might misfire or not fire at all. Soldiers then had to quickly scrape out the powder and start over, often while arrows or swords were much more immediate problems. The matches used to ignite the powder were dangerous too. Soldiers carried slow-burning cords, glowing at one end, trailing smoke, tucked into their belts or even behind their ear. In rain, they went out. In wind, they flared up. In battle, they set sleeves and hair on fire. Then came the matchlock. An improvement, yes, but still tricky. A lever dropped the glowing match onto the priming powder. Easier than touching it by hand, but still unpredictable. If the mechanism was dirty or damp or bent from use, it might not fall right or fall too soon. And if it fell too soon, well, there were stories of gunners losing eyes, hands, even half their face to a misfire. The barrels often weren't rifled, that came much later, so bullets flew irregularly, unpredictably. You could aim directly at someone and miss wildly, or hit someone far off you never meant to touch. Gunpowder quality varied too. Homemade mixes could be too weak to fire, or so strong they ruptured the weapon. Guns took time to load, measure powder, pack wadding, drop the ball, tamp it down, prime the pan, raise the weapon, steady your breath, and even then it might just pop and smoke, or do nothing, or explode. Gun crews in siege battles had a saying, "Fire once, dig twice," because each shot could leave a mark on the weapon or the man firing it. Even the larger artillery pieces, like bombards, sometimes exploded on their first firing. The bigger the barrel, the more powder required, and the more powder, the more danger. Metal fragments, flaming debris, even massive stones could be sent flying backward if something cracked. Still, they were used, because fear is a weapon too. Even an unreliable gun frightened men in armor. The sound, the smoke, the flash, it was alien, unfamiliar, and when it worked well, piercing armor, shattering morale, punching holes where swords only scratched. But those first firearms, they were temperamental, finicky, and often fatal for everyone. A weapon of progress, yes, but one that began its long legacy with more danger to the user than the enemy. When armies called, not everyone had a sword, or a spear, or armor, sometimes not even a helmet. What they did have, especially the peasants, were tools, rakes, scythes, flails, hooks, and when the banners rose and the soldiers marched, these tools followed, turned, often hastily and imperfectly, into weapons. The line between farming and fighting blurred, but the truth was, many of these weapons were never really designed to hurt anyone. They were built to till soil, to harvest grain, to dig, and on the battlefield they often showed it. One of the most common was the bill hook, originally a pruning tool used to trim branches, clear brush, or slice through stubborn vines. It had a hooked blade, wide near the base, curving inward like a question mark. In a fight, it could hook a man's arm or catch the edge of a shield. But it wasn't balanced for striking. Swung hard, it often twisted in the hand, missed, or stuck into the wrong thing entirely. Then there was scythe, massive curved blades attached to long wooden shafts, beautiful for cutting hay, terrible for battle. The blade faced the wrong direction, outward, sideways. To use it in combat, you had to reforge or remount it. Some soldiers didn't. They just swung it as is. The reach was impressive, the effectiveness less so. Scythes weren't made to pierce or crush, they sliced, and battle didn't wait for clean slicing angles. Worse, the blades bent easily under pressure. One bad swing into a shield could leave it twisted, dangling, or stuck. Flails, real flails, were threshing tools. Wooden handles with a swinging arm used to beat grain from stalks. Farmers used them every season, but against armor they were unreliable. The flail arm could rebound unpredictably. Missed swings often threw the user off balance, and when soldiers tried to add nails or spikes, it only made the weapon heavier and more chaotic. Pitchforks made appearances too. 2, sometimes 3 prongs. They had reach, but the tines bent easily. Against armor they struggled, against shields they glanced off, and stabbing into someone required a kind of steadiness not easily summoned in the swirl of battle. Shovels were used, axes meant for splitting logs, hammers used for nails, even sickles, which were small curved blades perfect for wheat and almost useless against anything that moved. Sometimes weapons were disguised as tools to avoid suspicion. Rebellions formed in silence. A man with a scythe raised no alarm until he did, but often it was the other way around. A call to arms went out, and the peasants came as they were, with what they had. They marched into war with the same handles they'd gripped in the fields, the same weight in their arms, the same tools they'd used to survive the season before. They weren't soldiers, they weren't trained, and their weapons weren't ready. Some added metal plates to reinforce them, some tried to carve grips into the handles, but most just carried them as is and hoped. Not every battle was won by strategy. Sometimes it was sheer numbers, lines of farmers, villagers, craftsmen, standing shoulder to shoulder, gripping the things they'd used to feed their families, now holding them like shields. They knew they weren't perfect, but a tool in hand was better than empty fingers, and for one swing, one moment, that tool might be enough. Not all swords were meant for battle. Some were forged for ceremony, for show, for the hands of kings and nobles who might never lift them in anger. They glittered, they gleamed, they bore names and blessings and jewels inlaid into their hilts. But on the battlefield, they weren't always useful, because some swords were simply too pretty to use. They were heavy, not in weight, but in meaning, engraved with prayers, mottos, or family crests, passed down from ancestor to ancestor, worn proudly during parades, hung above thrones, carried at weddings and coronations. They were symbols more than tools, and often that was exactly the problem. Many of these swords weren't balanced for combat. The blade might be too broad, the point too blunt, the steel too soft, because they were never meant to cut. They were meant to be seen, to catch the light, to show off status. Gold inlay ran along the fuller, silver wire wrapped the grip. Sometimes even gemstones were fitted into the crossguard. Beautiful, but not exactly practical. Some swords were sharpened only on one side, others not at all. They were drawn with ceremony, not speed, and yet, in desperate moments, even the ornamental sword might be drawn in earnest, and then the flaws revealed themselves. A gilded hilt might slip in a sweaty hand. A decorative pommel might unbalance the swing. The delicate engravings near the base might collect dirt or crack under pressure. And then there were swords made as gifts. Exotic blades from distant lands, curved, gilded, folded into delicate shapes, given from one monarch to another, placed on display, admired, but never tested, never trusted. A few were purely theatrical, made to be held during ceremonies, then returned to their cases. Some were hollow, some had no edge, some were not even steel, but tin or brass, or some other soft metal, chosen for polish rather than strength. Knights and lords knew which swords they could rely on, and which ones were for show. They carried the real blade in battle. The pretty ones stayed behind, or at their side, untouched, because to draw it in battle would be to risk losing it, chipping it, bending it, breaking it. And more than once that happened. A beautiful sword shattered in combat, and the pieces were gathered not as tools, but as relics, not because it had slain enemies, but because it had once belonged to someone important. Still, people loved these swords, loved what they represented: nobility, heritage, power. Even if they couldn't cut cloth, they were swords in name, and sometimes, in the quiet peace after battle, those were the only ones still intact, because the swords that had done the work were often left behind, buried in the mud, their beauty worn off by the weight of survival. So now, as the clang of metal fades and the battlefield grows still, we leave behind the swords and shields, the spears and scythes, and the weary hands that held them. We let them rest, We let them fall from memory, not in disgrace, but in understanding that even the mightiest weapons had flaws, and that those who carried them did so with uncertainty as much as courage. Tonight you've walked among warriors who made do with what they had, who stepped onto muddy fields with axes that stuck, bows that snapped, and armor that took an eternity to wear. You've seen the knights struggle with helmets too heavy to see through. You've felt the sting of splinters from shattered lances, and the quiet confusion of holding a farming tool in a war meant for steel. You've stood in shield lines that broke at the first strike, held flails that circled back to hit the user, lit fire weapons that burned the wrong tents, and yet, for every failure, for every awkward, broken, crooked piece of iron and wood, there was effort, there was intention, a belief that something, anything, could turn the tide, that a bent polearm or a snapped string might still hold a little hope. And that's the story we rarely hear, not the polished, heroic tale, but the real one, where soldiers fumbled with their gear, where horses refused to charge, where swords glittered from a distance but couldn't cut a thread. It's a quieter story, but in some ways a truer one, because war has never been clean, and those who stepped into it, prepared or not, did so with nerves, with doubts, and with the best tools they could find, even if those tools were just sharp sticks and stubborn hands. But we leave them now. We let them drift back into the past, where the dust has settled and the fields have grown quiet again. No more shouting, no more steel, only the soft wind across the ruins, the quiet clatter of a shield falling gently from where it was propped, and your breath, slow and even, in the peace that's come after. Let the stories fade, let the battles become shadows. There is nothing left to carry, nothing left to hold, only the warmth of your blanket, the comfort of stillness, and the distant memory of a time when even the fiercest warriors had to fight with weapons that barely worked. Sleep now. There's no need to remember how the sword was forged, or why the spear cracked, or whether the armor fit just right. They've all been laid to rest, and you can follow them softly into the quiet. Good night.